Donovan Mitchell signed an extension in Cleveland with a contract that might be the best thing for everyone involved, including you. If you clicked on this video, you have heard the news that Donovan Mitchell has signed an extension to stay a member of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Let's talk about the contract real quick, because he could have gotten like a Jamal Murray type deal of like 4 years for like $209 million, but he chose not to. He chose to sign a 2+1 style of a contract, a 3-year deal with a player option on the 3rd year. And for starters, this contract makes the most sense for Donovan Mitchell, because basically what it does is it allows him to align his next contract with his 10 years of service mark, which is when an NBA player can be eligible for a higher percentage of the cap on a max contract. So instead of only being able to get like 30% of the cap as he can now, he'll be able to be eligible for a 35% of the cap max deal in a year where the cap should be much higher than it is today. With the new TV deal coming in, it's gigantic. I can't remember the number, but there's a lot of zeros on it. And what they're projecting is that we could actually have $400 million contracts by the end of the 2020s, with as much as the cap is expected to go up. And part of that is because of the smoothing that they're putting in place. Remember back in, I believe it was 2017, when the cap spiked with a new TV deal and Kevin Durant ended up a Golden State Warrior because out of nowhere, a team that otherwise wouldn't was able to sign a max contract out of free agency. We also had a bunch of people getting big old contracts because teams had to pay someone. Well, they didn't want to do that again with this deal. So essentially, the cap won't go up by more than 10% year over year. However, they're projecting and expecting that it's going to go up by 10% every year once this new deal kicks in, like for a while. And so that's a big reason that Donovan Mitchell does this. He takes a small pay cut for next year because he opted out of like a $37 million option, and he's going to make just under like $35 million in the first year of this extension, but then it's going to immediately jump up to $46 and $50 million the next 2 seasons, and then he can opt out. And instead of making $54 million in that opt-out year, $58 million if this was a 4-year deal, he can start his next max contract, which could start in the ballpark of about $65 million and get yearly raises from there, which I believe are standard like 8%. So needless to say, Donovan Mitchell maximizing his earning potential, this is the ideal contract for him. I think it's also not just best for Donovan Mitchell, but it's the best thing for the Cavs. Because one, you get the commitment from Mitchell that it is okay to build your team around Donovan Mitchell. He is staying. And you have a clear window for improvement. You've got 2 years to take the next step forward as a team. And they know that they have to keep improving because there's still a sense of urgency. Because you've got 2 years and he can opt out and become a free agent. But gone is the feeling of we can't commit to building around a guy who won't commit to us. However, the improvement's not going to come easy, which we'll talk about in a bit. But in terms of this contract, it might just be best for Donovan Mitchell because he gets to keep his money and keeps some urgency in the front office. Best for the Cavs because they get that commitment and a clear window for improving this team. And best for the fans, best for you, because you keep the best player on your team and you know that the front office should be motivated to continue and improve this team. So how do they do that? What is next? Is it potentially a Darius Garland trade? And who initiates that? There were rumors going around that his representation was going to request a trade if Donovan Mitchell did re-sign in Cleveland. I haven't heard anything on that recently. I haven't heard any news come out of a trade request since Donovan Mitchell agreed to his extension, at least not as of recording this video. I also don't think that the Cavs want to trade Darius Garland, and they shouldn't. Unless he requested it and there's a deal that actually makes sense, they shouldn't be in a hurry to make a move just for the sake of breaking them up. But they shouldn't consider him untouchable either. If there's a deal to be made that nets them a better talent and fit, and that deal hinges on Darius Garland, you have to explore it as a viable option if you're Cleveland. Now, personally, I still think that Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell can work with certain protections in place to limit the concerns that you have. They're still small. They're still not great defenders. Mitchell does compete a little bit more on that end than Garland, but on the whole, they are not good on the defensive end of the floor. But they both can shoot, and they shouldn't be so clunky on offense. And that's where Kenny Atkinson can come in. If he can introduce some movement to the offense and get them both more active off the ball, that can make a huge difference for an offense that has gotten so stagnant at times with just one of them running high pick and roll while the other one stands at half court and watches. And now I know some people are out on Darius Garland because of last year's regression. I believe that had more to do with his body than anything else. He broke his jaw. He had to have it wired shut. He had a liquid diet for like weeks. He lost a bunch of weight, and I think he was just never right physically, and he lost confidence as a result. A healthy offseason and a solid program to get strength and confidence back should go a long way for Darius. But still, if there's a similarly talented wing that can be had and Garland is the cost, that's got to be considered. And hard. But there's no guarantee that that's even an option. The next avenue to explore and kind of figure out is whether or not to split up the bigs. This seems to me like more of a glaring issue from a redundancy standpoint than Garland and Mitchell in the backcourt. They were just simply a better team when they had one center anchoring the defense and more shooting around the ball handler last year than they were when Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley played together. Unless Mobley can find a ton more three-point shooting volume, they're going to be a negative spacing team on offense with these two playing together. Now, there is some hope there. Evan Mobley did shoot 37% on threes last year, which is great. But he took barely more than one a game, and he needs to be more like 4 at least to be respected by the defense. And they were both awesome individually as 5s. Now, the league is trending bigger. You've got Kat and Gobert in Minnesota. You've got Jokic and Aaron Gordon out in Denver. Chet just got Hartenstein in Oklahoma City. Kristaps Porzingis and Al Horford even in Boston. But what do they all have in common? Spacing. They may be two center-sized player, but at least one of them is a legit shooting threat that stretches the floor. It's the same going all the way back to 2020 when the Lakers won the title. They played AD next to either Dwight or JaVale McGee a ton, but he was also shooting really well. He was shooting like 38% from 3 that year in the playoffs. Without the space, this duo will continue to be a dominant force on one end while being a spacing disaster on the other. Kind of no matter where you fall on the backcourt and the frontcourt, they still need to find a wing, it seems. And they're not alone. Every team needs wings. And the Cavs have needed wing size since before Mitchell even came into the fold. They were considered crazy, if you can remember this, when they put Lauri Markkanen at the 3 when they got him, and honestly, they were doing it out of necessity. They literally had no other good options available to them at the time. And not much has changed. They've tried. Max Strus was a really good signing last year. And he's a little bit taller, but he doesn't really hold up defensively defending bigger wings, and he's more like a good size 2 than a 3. Isaac Okoro is a really good defender, but he's 6'5". Karis LeVert, 6'5", 6'6", and the guy they just drafted, 6'5". If you can say anything about the Cavs, they love their redundancies. But finding the right fit that's also attainable, not easy to do, obviously. So if you're not splitting up the backcourt, you're not splitting up the front court, you can't find a wing, that leaves internal development. Can Evan Mobley develop three-point volume? Can Darius Garland become an off-ball threat? If Okoro comes back, can he get taller? That last one's a joke. But if the core 4 comes back, Atkinson has his work cut out for him to try to create space that's needed in a modern NBA offense that hopes to compete at the top of the league. And make no mistake, that's the goal, to continue improving on a team that was a second-round exit. That means conference finals, and that means finals contention. That is what you're striving for. And one thing that they can do is try to play faster. The Cavs were 24th in pace last year, and if they can turn their defense into offense more frequently and get out in transition, that can help mitigate some of the spacing that they have in the half court. And if he can introduce more off-ball movement, some spacing can be found in running guys off of screens and the gaps that are created while the defense is chasing them or scrambling or rotating. And the good news is, Kenny Atkinson has a reputation for player development. And these Cavs are young. This core can still be the answer moving forward, but it's going to take that development. Core 4 or not, development or not, there's still going to be some roster adjustments that are probably going to be required. So I want to take this next portion of the video to discuss some possible targets that they could have realistically as of right now that I'm recording this in where we are with the offseason and free agency. So we've talked about wing, right? They definitely need a wing, particularly a wing with size. They are stacked with two guards essentially, and they're all having to play time at the 2 and the 3. And honestly, with Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell on the court a lot, mostly they're playing 2s at the 3. So what wings with size are out there? We've heard about Brandon Ingram ad nauseum at this point, but whoever gets him is getting the privilege of negotiating his next contract in the summer, and all the chatter around him says that he thinks he's a max guy. Do you want to trade Jarrett Allen for that? DeAndre Hunter out of Atlanta. He might be attainable, and I'm actually going to get into that one in a minute. But some other names are like Simone Fontecchio. He's an interesting restricted free agent, but there's probably not a lot of chance of prying him away with an offer. The Cavs don't have the cap space. Could they get in the mix with the Nets rebuild and find a way to grab Dorian Finney-Smith or Cam Johnson? Yeah, maybe, but what do the Cavs have to offer a rebuilding team like the Nets? They spent all their picks getting Mitchell. Do they run it back with Utah and try to get Lauri Markkanen back? I don't see how that works without, like, Darius Garland in the deal. Or do you just go small and with a vet like Doug McDermott, who doesn't really have the size, but at least he stretches the floor? And if not a wing, do you try to go back up big that's got some stretch to him? Jalen Smith made sense, and Cavs Twitter loved him for about 24 hours, but now that he's been scooped up, is it Dario Saric maybe? The point is that it's really easy to say that the Cavs need to add somebody or they need to make a trade, but it's really hard to come up with what that trade is or who that free agent is if they're not moving off of this core 4. And if they do move off the core 4 in some way, it's definitely not Mitchell. You got to figure it's not Mobley. So that leaves Garland and Jarrett Allen as the possibilities. And many of the teams that made the most sense for either of those guys, they've addressed those needs on their roster for the most part. The Pelicans traded for DeJounte Murray. The Spurs signed Chris Paul. The Thunder signed Isaiah Hartenstein. Now, I still think that the Spurs would love the opportunity to pair Darius Garland with Wemby. And Chris Paul as a mentor is actually kind of great for him. But what's on the Spurs roster that the Cavs would want? Keldon Johnson, the 6'5" wing that doesn't shoot threes, and then stuff? The point is that the potential deals are sort of drying up, and the Cavs, for their own part, simply don't have a ton to offer in trades outside of the core 4. Karis LeVert's really the biggest piece, right? At $16 million on an expiring contract, that's got value. But to who? Usually, there's two types of teams that want to trade for an expiring contract. One is a contender, but they aren't sending value back in terms of players because they're contenders. They want to add without losing the guys that make them contenders. And then there's sellers. they might be trying to shed some salary that's more long-term on their books by bringing in an expiring deal that's going to come off of the books much sooner. So who's that team for Caris LeVert? This is where maybe Atlanta could come into play. They get LeVert's expiring contract and give the Cavs back DeAndre Hunter, who's on the books through 2027. I checked Spot Track, and the finances should work. It might throw a wrench in re-signing Isaac Okoro, so you may need to add a little salary on the Cleveland side. And then it probably comes down to which team thinks that they should get some picks in the deal, to be honest, because, one-for-ones don't really happen outside of Giddey and Caruso. Everybody's got to have picks. And maybe this is where Brooklyn, that I mentioned before, wants to do something with Cam Johnson's money, but I have to imagine that he's more valuable on the trade market than a Caris LeVert reunion from a team that doesn't have draft picks. Outside of Caris, there's Max Strus, but he's a guy that they just signed, and I imagine they want to keep locked up around $15 million. Even though he didn't shoot it as well from an efficiency standpoint from three, he still was guarded like a lights-out three-point shooter, and he's really the only player on this team outside of Garland and Mitchell that creates space at all. So I have to imagine that it would have to be a very big swing for the Cavs to want to include Strus in any kind of deal. And outside of that, there's not much. Isaac Okoro, a sign-and trade? I don't think there's a ton of market for that. Is he young enough to entice Brooklyn? Maybe, but probably not that plausible. Ultimately, the Cavs may not be making moves right now because there's not moves to be made. And that might not be the end of the world, I suppose. Even if the Cavs do have to stand pat from a roster standpoint, it's not inconceivable that they can't improve simply due to their age. And by that, I mean lack of it. They're very young. The youth should develop naturally. And just having a healthier season, better injury luck would be very helpful for this team. Given that they might not be title contenders, but they're still likely to be in that top group of the East, competing for home court in the first round, I would think. However, the Sixers and the Knicks both just made big swings. The Celtics have paid all their guys coming back off of a title, and the Magic, Pacers, and Bucks are going to be in the mix. The East isn't the gauntlet that the West is, but it's still going to be competitive, and the middle, those are good teams. The Cavs seem to be a big jump away from rising up to that top tier and being true contenders and truly making that improvement that we're looking for in this Mitchell contract window. So where's that jump come from? Either a big trade or a big leap from a guy named Evan Mobley. What do you think the Cavs' next move is now that Mitchell is back? Let me know in the comments, and make sure you like, subscribe, do all the things, and I'll catch you in the next one.